Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Conservation Conversations. My name is Ana Sangronis, and I work for the University of Florida IFAS Extension Service in Miami-Dade County. This webinar series is a joint effort between UF IFAS Extension and Florida Sea Grant and Miami EcoAdventures. We have these webinars every second Wednesday of the month at 6 p.m., currently through May. And we're excited to have you here and get to know new people. So if this is your first time joining us, welcome. If you would like to receive an email with the monthly conservation conversation topic, please let us know in the chat box, or you can email me. I'll be placing my email in the chat box shortly. Everyone is currently muted with your cameras off, and we ask that you remain that way. We will have a question and answer section at the conclusion of the presentation with Ed. So please utilize the chat box to place your questions there. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand the microphone over to Ed Pritchard, our featured presenter this evening from Miami EcoAdventures. Take it away, Ed.
Thanks so much, Anna, and thank you guys all for being here tonight and for joining us for another episode of Conservation Conversations. As Anna said, my name is Ed Pritchard, and I am a co-host of this webinar series, and I'm really happy to be able to present tonight on a topic that I really find fascinating, and that is on traveling sea beans. So just a little bit about me. So I'm an interpretive program supervisor with the Miami-Dade County Parks Department. We have a division called Miami EcoAdventures, and I serve as the manager of the Crandon Park and Biscayne Nature Center out on Key Biscayne, which is a oceanside nature center that we feature a lot of our local history, ecology, and access to the beach. So I was actually born and raised here in South Florida, and I've always had a passion for our region's flora and fauna. I grew up just up the road in Jupiter, where the Gulf Stream actually comes closest to the state. And one of my favorite childhood memories was one that I shared with my father. We would spend hours, usually on the weekends, beachcombing and searching Jupiter Beach for treasures, specifically these sea beans. He introduced me to these. He said they're, good luck. And, it was always fun to kind of go on the hunt for beans. And fast forward to today, in my current career, fortunately, I get to spend quite a bit of time out on the beach. So I'm always kind of on the lookout for these treasures. So just a quick little overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So we are going to talk a little bit more about what actually sea beans are, where do they come from, how do they make it here to our shorelines. So I'll introduce you to some of the different varieties, some more common than others. Where exactly are they found on our beaches, some different uses and how to grow them. We'll talk about this sea bean community that actually exists here in South Florida and in other parts of the United States. And then just some general, an outline of beachcombing and beach stewardship. So without further ado, so what exactly are these little ocean-going envoys? So sea beans, although they really are beans, they do not actually come from the ocean. There are 250,000 species of seed-bearing, flowering plants on Earth, but only about 250 of those species actually make drift seeds or seeds that are capable of floating on ocean currents and ones that are impervious to salt water. So that's about 1/10 of 1%. So it's pretty special to be a sea bean. So these sea beans that wash up on Florida beaches, they usually begin their life in a tropical rainforest, usually at the lower latitudes, and they hang from a pod or on a flowering vine, shrub, or tree. And the seed pod usually falls to the forest floor and it's washed away by heavy rains into a stream or a river. And then it's carried out to sea where it could float, on the surface of the ocean, sometimes in flotsam, and it can drift in the ocean currents, usually washing up onto a beach elsewhere, or it can be floating in the ocean for years. And what allows them to do that? So they have air pockets, which allows them to float. Others are just constructed of materials that are usually lighter than seawater. But it's really that fibrous outer casing that surrounds that air pocket, or is what makes up most of that being surrounding the seed itself. And that's really what that makes it, able to float and able to withstand all that ocean, the harsh oceans. It's interesting, many early peoples, even Europeans, they thought these things were stones just because of how hard they were. And you can see this anatomy here on the bottom. One of the more common sea beans that you might not think of as sea bean, but coconuts are a type of sea bean because it floats in the ocean and it can withstand that salt water and wash up. And so it has this what's called a mesocarp, which is that flesh or the husk. And then it has a seed coating, which is an endocarp. So those are the things that are really the mesocarp, the endocarp, and then this even outer layer, the exocarp, that allows it to keep that internal, that living seed safe. And then they also have other distinguishing features. We'll talk about some of these beans later and their appearance, but this hilum, which is an attachment scar, basically where it was attached to the vine, as you can see in the picture on the left. So collectors also refer to sea beans as drifters. And then sea beans come, in many shapes, sizes, and different colors. So some are small, some are large, are brown, are colorful. Some are, easily overlooked. Some are, pretty easy to spot. So we're going to talk about some of those in just a second. So where do they come from? So we talked about, again, they're usually originating in the lower latitudes. So many a beachgoer, though, has been fascinated by the fact that these drift seeds, or these drifters, could be from almost anywhere in the world. Early Europeans actually thought that these drift seeds floated up from underwater forests, and they believed because of that they were endowed with curative or even magical powers. One such sea bean, actually, the sea heart pictured here, is actually said to have a hand in world history. It's said that it inspired Christopher Columbus, to search for the lands to the west, because these seeds would wash up from the west. And so the sea heart is actually still called the Columbus bean in the Azores, which is some 800 miles off the coast of Portugal. And so with that, your imagination can just kind of run wild as to where these things might be originating from. And so in that right, a sea bean, it can really hold this mystique, very similar to, a message in a bottle, or some, foreign object coming onto your shore. But most of the sea beans that we find here in South Florida beaches, they come our way from the Caribbean, from South America, Central America, and even the Florida Keys. So somewhere a little bit closer. And that's thanks largely to our currents. And so along our Florida coast, we have the Gulf Stream. That's a north flowing current. And so it's bringing these beans up from these regions in the lower latitudes. And really, southeastern Florida is a collector's paradise, or a great place to look for these, given the proximity to the sources. But not all of them, that originate in those latitudes wash ashore here. Some will actually travel, continue on that Gulf Stream, and can go on these transatlantic voyages. They can actually reach the United Kingdom, Norway, Greenland, Iceland. So really, these beans can make their way across. In the days before ocean currents were really understood, these sea beans, because of them washing up in Europe, they really gave rise to a lot of lore and legend, as well as practical and medicinal uses, which we'll elaborate on a little later. So why sea beans travel so far from the tropics when they really can't survive cold climates is kind of nature's secret. So perhaps the plants are expanding their range by just indiscriminately sending the seeds out to sea. And they're usually equipped for this long and wet passage. So it's really kind of a mystery and a part of the mystique behind these. But how do they actually get here? So again, talking about the currents in a little bit more detail. So plant dispersal by ocean currents has been something that has fascinated a lot of many famous explorers, including Charles Darwin, pictured here. Currents have been studied also by the U.S. Coast Guard, the Geodetic Survey, using drift cards, using buoys, those sorts of things. So it really, ocean currents are more understood, and they really have been utilized for all sorts of different, commercial uses and development. But speaking about Charles Darwin, so during his famous voyage around the world on the HMS Beagle, Darwin actually championed the idea of drift seeds and fruits colonizing distant shorelines and distant islands. Particularly, he was looking at isolated volcanic islands, which have never, in terms of shifting tectonic plates, have never really been connected to a mainland. So Darwin studied that role that ocean currents played in. Specifically, he was looking at the flora derived in drift seeds found on the Cocos Keeling Islands, which is in the Indian Ocean. And he concluded that most of those endemic vascular flora actually were derived from drift seeds and fruits that floated there from the nearby mainland. And then after he returned from that journey on the Beagle back to England, he concluded, after doing various flotation experiments with many seeds from cultivated plants, that there's not a lot that actually can float. He was kind of the first one to kind of start to narrow down, okay, only so many can withstand that seawater and can actually float instead of sink. So many cultivated plants, the seeds would just sink in fresh water or salt water. So and he published about this in Origin of Species, and he really summarized that experimental data on seed dispersal. So as we mentioned, only 250 varieties can float these great distances in the oceans. And so which ones are most common here in South Florida? So I'm going to go through a few common and often recognized sea beans, as well as a few that are rarities, that are kind of the collector's, in the collector's mind. I'm going to share some of those with you here tonight. All right, so here are some varieties, and I'm going to start with a few that are easily distinguished by their shape. And so the one on the left, there's actually two there, two varieties. We have the hamburger bean. They're also known by their scientific name, mucuna. And these are beans that originate from vines along the Amazon. And they look very much like the entree that they're named for, but in much smaller dimensions. So in some countries, they're actually called horse eye or ox eye, depending on which one you're referring to. And these are two that are very common here in South Florida and are, usually often, picked up because of what they look like. So the red hamburger is the one on the left, can be difficult to distinguish from the one on the right, the brown one, but for subtle differences with their shape. So you can see the red hamburger bean is a little flatter, and it has that reddish appearance, but it has almost like a mottled or speckled black on the top side and the bottom. And then the brown is more circular, and you can tell that band, which they call a hilum, that encircles about 3/4 of each of those beans. It's a little wider on the brown compared to the red. So because these are so common, on our shorelines, they have to have a high survival rate, right? So in the rainforest where they grow on vines, they actually they're growing in thorny pods. So you saw it in one of the previous slides. They grow in those really thorny pods, and the outer casing is so hard, and it really keeps them from being eaten by predators, and it explains their ability to kind of end up here in great numbers. So this is one that really has one of the hardest outer casings. The second one here in the middle is called the sea heart. So this one originates from a high climbing woody vine known as the monkey ladder vine that is growing in the Caribbean. And so these are usually They can kind of come in various shapes, but obviously the name comes from this kind of heart-like appearance. And they're usually a brown or black. And each pod, when it's growing on the vine, contains about 10 to 15 seeds enclosed in like individual compartments. So these compartments are usually fragile, and they really don't endure a trip on the water. So they usually break out of those pods once they hit the water. And as we mentioned, aside from Columbus's journey and their connection, in Old England, actually, sea hearts were seen as good luck charms for seafarers because they had weathered such a long journey. Also, babies usually teethed on these outer coatings of the seeds, so they were used for that purpose. And then early Norwegians actually brewed a tea from this husk of the sea heart, and they gave it to women giving birth, as a medicinal purpose. And they also made medicine for cattle, for their livestock. And then even more people use them. Actually, they would have them and put like a hinge, and they would use them as like snuff boxes, and little compartments for other small items. So they had some different uses for Europeans when they washed up on the shores there. And then the third one here is the sea coconut. So these grow on palms known as basu palms. And they usually grow in these little hard casings that you see on the bottom, sometimes in sometimes in threes, but usually in twos. And often you can find, actually, this is one of the few that you can find them wash up on the beaches here still in that seed pod. And they are usually found, the one on top has that, we talked about the endocarp, that outer casing. But usually the seed, once it's out of that pod itself, the seed usually is, it washes away that endocarp, so you can find them very bare. And then those basu palms, where they originate from, they grow near rivers in the American tropics. So these are making their way up from the Caribbean. So the next slide has a few more common finds. The native of Southeast Asia, but one that can also be found growing in dunes here in South Florida, is the gray knickernut, or the knicker bean. This one is the shrub actually produces like a spiny little pod that usually grows in a dense thicket, and they're usually up just beyond the dune and the sometimes in the high tide zone. And since they are located close to water, it's not surprising that they are common, and they're common drift seeds, but also common to find on the beach here in South Florida. In Jamaica, the seeds were actually used as medicine. Sometimes they were used as coat buttons because they're kind of small and can be kind of attached to clothing. And that other people would actually use them as marbles. They do take on that shape, and they're about that same size, and they can be very round. And so another name for marble is where it gets its name. So knicker is another name for marble. The second one here is the tropical almond. So these are cork-like fruits. And they usually are found in various states of degradation. The one here is very kind of polished and not weathered. So this was more fresh or didn't have to have such a long journey. But they usually fall from these large leaf trees that are found in, they're native to Asia, but they're found, they've been introduced to the tropics, and they can actually be invasive species in some places, including here in South Florida. So we do find tropical almonds here in South Florida. And so these ones here pictured that are not very weathered probably came from a South Florida tree, and just washed up on the beach. And then the one to the right, another nut or seed, if you will, is the tropical walnut. So they have that smooth wrinkled surface, and they're depressed at one end and blunt at the other. And their colors can be gray or black. They very much look like a walnut. And they grow in the Caribbean, in like Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico. And one study found that these can actually float for up to 5 years. So these can really withstand a long journey. One more slide of common finds before I show you some rarities. So the one on the left, the grenade-shaped blister pod, these grow in the Amazon and Orinoco river basins in South America. So these really do make a long journey, and they definitely show their wear and tear. So you can see the blisters. Usually they have, holes and cracks and open blisters. But the air pockets inside that allows it to float is, protected and usually remains and keeps the pod floating. So these are interesting. They're light when you pick them up. So, often they can be, carried in the wind and can be carried up the beach. Another Asian-based seed is the sea purse, or also called the saddle bean. So this one is very pretty, has that distinct look with it's usually an orange or brown, has that streaking or mottled look to it. It gets its name, you can expect it to just snap open and spill out coins. And this one's really kind of a fun one to have in your collection. And it is very buoyant and it can float, for long periods of time. And it's often used, we'll talk about, a lot of people use these sea beans for jewelry. This one's a popular one. And then lastly here for the common finds is a star nut palm. This one's usually a black or gray. It comes from these palms that are native to tropical America or the West Indies. But their seeds are more oblong, so they're pretty, distinguished with their, you can see that teardrop shape. And they usually have they look like coconuts with the little holes. And then they have those streaks that run up to the top. As with, the other palms, the seeds do, have those different casings, so they can, they can last quite a while as well. All right, so a couple rarities that, is usually the bane of a lot of collectors' existence, and specifically for me, the Mary's bean. So this one on the left, also it's called the crucifixion bean. So you can see the size of it and where it gets its name on the bottom. It bears that impression of a cross on one side, and then it has that almost like fetus-like image, the womb-like image on the other. So this woody vine that produces the Mary's bean, it's a member of a Guatemalan forest species. So it can be found in a rainforest or more mixed forests. And it's actually a relative to a plant that we find here on our shorelines, the morning glory. If you ever seen those bright purple flowers that grow along the dune here in South Florida, that's a relative of the Mary's bean vine. And so obviously, it's in many cultures and whatnot in history. The Mary's bean, it's given to a daughter to help, or a woman in childbirth to help them through, and so it's used for a number of different religious purposes. The middle one is the little marble. Pretty easy to see why. They're glossy, very stone hard. It has that hilum or that band, but it's very thin and it's kind of lipped compared to the hamburger beans that we talked about. And so these originate in Central American rainforests, and they grow in vines in the canopy. And then the last one here is the thick-banded mucuna. So another relative to the hamburger beans, the red and brown we talked about earlier. They're similar, but they have obviously this really thick hilum or band, and they're more flattened, more like a disc shape. And the origins of this ones are actually a mystery. They're rare, and they haven't been really able to track or find these. Could be the Caribbean. There's other species that are similar to them, so that's what the common thought is. But again, adding to the mystery, we still don't know where some of these originate. All right, so of course we have those sea beans, but then there's a few others that I wanted to just point out that can be found alongside our sea beans that are actually things that are coming from plants that grow on our shorelines. So the first one is the coin vine. On the left, sometimes these are called fakey beans because they look from the top as one of those hamburger beans, but they're more of a flat, almost like disc, and they grow on these coin vines, which you'll see growing in the dunes of South Florida. Of course, we have our mangrove species and their seed pods. The red mangrove, they look like these green beans. These actually float and they're viviparous, meaning they're able to drop from the tree and don't need to be germinated. They're just ready to go. So they'll float until they find a suitable substrate and sprout up. We have the black mangrove here. They look like little oval shaped, almost like accordions. These are often mistaken for beans, but they're the seeds of the mangrove, the black mangrove, and then the bay bean, which you may have seen, again, looks similar to a morning glory, but this is another vine that grows along our shoreline. And you can see these seed pods. They're very similar. They're very long, elongated, and they just open up, and there's tons of these little small beans. These are more like half the size of a dime. So these are much smaller. So those are just a few that you might find in the same areas as a sea bean, but these are more local, and more of our local species of coastal species. All right. And then, of course, it would be remiss to not mention some of our other beach treasures, especially when you're talking about collecting things. Obviously, South Florida is a great place to find all sorts of treasures. We have shells, we have sea glass, echinoderm tests. So those are things like sea urchins and sea stars, things like of that nature. The paper nautilus, this is a really cool, rare find, especially finding them in completely whole. They're a type of octopus. This is the thing on the bottom right. It's a type of octopus that makes this this paper thin like casing. And so these are really neat to find. Of course, driftwood to make, really neat furniture and other art out of. Toys, some people collect, toys from foreign countries. Even know someone who, maybe others on the call might know, someone who collects doll parts and doll heads. So those wash up as well. All sorts of crazy items. And we'll talk about marine debris a little bit later, but all sorts of man-made items that wash up. And then lastly, things like drift cards. We talked about how, we track ocean currents and how things travel in them using drift cards and buoys. But we also have things used for research purposes, for maybe tracking wildlife, things such as tags and tracking devices that maybe are attached to sharks or sea turtles. So it's always interesting to find those. And usually they have markings that you can reach out to the owners of them and let them know where you found it. All right. So where specifically on the beach can you find sea beans when they wash up? So, now that you know a little bit more about where they are, or where they originate from and what they look like, you're going to be on the lookout for them. So in the rack line is the best place to find these. This is really how they make their way to our shorelines. They get caught up in the rack line. The algae, the flotsam, all that debris, and it washes up on our shoreline. So the rack line specifically, it's that area on the beach where all that organic material and other debris is discarded at high tide. So typical debris that could be tree trunks, seagrass, algae, other deceased sea life like sponges, soft corals, all that stuff. So and again, it's brought in by the tides. So oftentimes you can search through that flotsam and that rack line as it's right there at the high tide line. And then, of course, storms and other events push that rack line even farther up. So you can find successive rack lines as you make your way up the beach. And so, again, it's all fair game. And sometimes they'll be hidden and they'll kind of get blown out of the sargassum and the rack line, and they'll just be sitting there in the sand. So it's always good to go up to the very top. And the picture on the right, you can see it's all the way up in the dune where the sea oats and the vegetation starts growing. You can find them up there. So just a quick quiz, that photo in the middle, can you spot the sea bean now that we've talked about some of the different types? And you might notice there's a couple other things in there that shouldn't be there. So I don't know if you guys want to put in the chat, if you can pick out the sea bean that's in that photo. I'll give you a few seconds there. Do you have any guesses, Anna?
No, not yet. I was just typing that. I can't tell. Kate says, is it in the top right? And Deborah's saying an almond or a blister.
Yep, Deborah is correct. So there's a tropical almond. It's that brown item, or kind of this like cork-like colored item right in the middle with a piece of seagrass attached to it. So it's sitting on its side. and it's weathered. Remember, we mentioned the tropical almonds can really look weathered. So that one was really tricky, and congrats to Deborah on getting that one. And then, of course, we have this bottle cap, which should not be there. And so, of course, that flotsam and that rack line can pick up all sorts of marine debris. So I mentioned the word sargassum. So really here in South Florida, that is the thing that we're going to find a lot of those sea beans wash up in. And I'm sure those that live here are familiar with sargassum, but you know, and has maybe a dislike of it, but don't panic. It's organic. Sargassum is something that is natural. It's a type of brown algae or seaweed that actually floats across the ocean. It accumulates in large mats out in the open ocean, and then it is washed in, you know, with our currents and tides. So it's a type of algae. And if you look at the picture on the right with the cute sea turtles, it has those little berry-like appendages, which help them, it's holding gas, which helps it float. And really that presence of sargassum is natural, of course, with rising ocean temperatures and nutrient pollution. We've started to see a larger bloom of it, which means more on our beach, which can really be, you know, especially here in Florida where we rely on our beaches for tourism, it's been tough to find this balance between you know, removing it, but leaving it because it's a natural part of the ecosystem. So what are some of the benefits of it? So in the ocean, it's a floating ecosystem. There are animals that only are endemic and can only live in the sargassum, things such as the sargassum fish. They live their entire life in that habitat. And then, of course, it's a nursery area for a ton of juvenile fish, commercially important fish, such as mahi-mahi. And then, of course, our sea turtles, the hatchlings, when they hatch on our beaches, they make their way out to these sargassum mats to spend their first few years growing up, feeding, and finding protection. And then when it washes in, on the left, you see all of our shorebirds. There's a ton of animals that forage in that sargassum as it's on the beach, and really rely on it for their livelihood. So, and then once that sargassum breaks down, it actually adds nutrients, and replenishes the beach, and helps to make it more resilient to erosion. So it really is an important feature, an important ecosystem, both in the ocean and our beach. And again, you know, it's yes, we find our fun treasures in it, but it makes our beaches, you know, resilient and is important to our important wildlife. So the sign here in the middle is one that Anna and I worked on. You'll find it here in Miami-Dade County along our beaches, just letting people know, you know, a little bit more about this ecosystem. All right, so back to sea beans, and let's talk a little bit more as once you find them, what can be done with them besides just collecting them? A lot of people ask, can they be eaten? You know, you hear the word sea bean. Are they a type of bean like you can throw in some rice and put some chicken on top? No, not really. They're not that tasty, and you know, as we mentioned, they have that really hard outer casing, so it's really not such an easy one to eat. Now, that being said, there are ones that can be eaten straight from the plant. So tropical almonds are one that are used in some different cuisines and the tropics. Of course, the coconut we mentioned, that's a type of sea bean. That one has tons of uses. But other uses for it, which we might not think about, but medicinal. I mentioned some of the medicinal uses that the Europeans used it for. But the mucuna, the hamburger beans, are actually used as supplements because they're rich in this alkaloid known as L-DOPA. And it's also used as medicinally to treat tremors for Parkinson's. So they have some important medicinal purposes, and again, can be used as supplements. On the right there, you'll see there's that extract, and so that can be put in all sorts of things. So yes, they have purposes, but really they aren't a traditional cuisine. But other uses, a lot of people, you know, again, we talked about how they grow, you know, in these more lower latitude regions, but they can be sprouted here. Now, they won't usually germinate and sprout on the beach, but if you take them home and you follow some steps, you can actually sprout them in your own home, which is really interesting. A lot of people, you know, kind of can add to their garden. So here are just a few steps. So I mentioned here, and ones that are usually the most likely to be sprouted are the hamburger beans and the sea hearts. So really to what you need to do is to grow any sea bean, you have to reach that living seed inside. You have to break through that hard casing. The first thing you really need to do is drill a hole or sand it down until you reach that, and you'll notice the inner casing, the living seed is a different color. It doesn't have that hard and dark outer color. So once you've reached it, you'll leave it in a shallow dish of fresh water for a few hours, about 5 to 6 hours, until it soaks up, it absorbs that water, and it'll look a little bit swollen. And then from there, you can remove that swollen seed and plant it in warm, moist soil and wait for it to sprout. So it usually takes about 2 to 4 weeks. If it's a viable seed, again, sometimes they aren't viable and you'll have to start over or find other ones. But it usually takes about 2 to 4 weeks to sprout. And then once sprouted, you can repot it in some good potting soil, give it direct sunlight, continue watering it, and then you'll have this vine growing, and you can, kind of put it on a windowsill or put it outside. So, and in that early stage, it can actually grow about 2 inches a day. So it really takes off. So something to try if you've collected some and you have some at home, or if you are going to start this journey and you want to see this thing in its full growth. All right, so there's a whole community around this. People that love beachcombing, and there's tons of people like that here in Florida. They have a whole community. So, or they collect other things, and they've kind of found their way into collecting sea beans. It fits right into their hobby. Maybe they started with sea glass, or they started with shells, and they've learned more about sea beans and started to add them. Again, sometimes it's you're looking, it's almost like birding, and you're trying to find those really rare ones. So it's kind of a cool competition, a cool hobby. But sea bean collectors, they often refer to themselves, they have their own name for themselves as beaners. And their activity is called beaning. So searching for sea beans, it can be very relaxing, it can be rewarding. And again, finding these treasures, it can be good luck. That's kind of how my dad got me into it. So, and of course, they can be used for all sorts of really creative purposes. Artists, craftspersons, they collect sea beans and they make them into these really beautiful jewelry, other artwork with driftwood and all sorts of other beach treasures. And yeah, once they're polished, they really almost look like shells. So it's really neat what people have done with them. And so if you're super passionate about, or just curious about them, or you want to see how others have turned them into art, there's actually an international symposium, the International Sea Bean Symposium, that happens pretty much on an annual basis. They're usually once a year. They're free, open to the public. You'll find vendors. They sell the art, jewelry. There's speakers, researchers, all sorts of fun activities. This one here, the Odd Bean Contest, you can go and show off your really cool find, or your odd bean. And they also have like a sharing table where you can trade your cool beach finds and things like that. So if you're interested, this year's symposium, there's one it's in Cocoa Beach on October 20th and 21st. So there you go. Hopefully by then, if you're just learning today, you have plenty of time to get into this hobby. So yeah, start a sea bean collection. So now that you know about sea beans, you're ready for the hunt, right? So here's some, I just put together a few good tips as to, things to consider when hunting for or starting this collection. So there's a few things you should really keep in mind. I talked about how they get here. And so if you know anything about, your local beach, you know that, some are better than others in terms of finding stuff on the shoreline. So most important thing, find a safe beach to do it. Find one that you can easily get to. If you're, not near a beach and, you have travel planned, keep these things in mind. So another thing is a beach that is a reflective beach. So reflective meaning you have those waves breaking right on shore. That's really creating and bringing in a lot of stuff. Those are usually good beaches, usually ones that don't have a lot of strong wave action. You're not going to have as much stuff wash up. Also one that isn't regularly cleaned. Of course, here in South Florida, we talked about tourism. They take those big beach rakers and they clear the beach of all that sargassum in the morning. Good time to get out there. Try to get there before they, come out. And that's usually right at daybreak. Especially if you want to take advantage of, a tide that's bringing in stuff the night before. Currents, of course. So we talked about the Gulf Stream. So September and October are actually the months where that current is actually traveling more closely to shore. So those are the best months to, have those things wash up. And then of course, other factors related to the currents, the winds, the breeze, that helps push those sea beans and those treasures in. And again, that September, October, we usually see more of that weather, and that usually makes its way into the wintertime here in South Florida. You have those easterly winds and swells. I talked about tides. Again, after a high tide, that's not going to be always the case, but obviously that's when the most fresh stuff is up there right at the high tide line. Time of day, again, early morning also, because again, there's other collectors out there. They're going to get out there early too, so you want to beat them, right? Early bird gets the sea bean. So they morning is a good time, and it's also in terms of the light too. You have the sun reflecting off that, and you can see it, based on the shadows with this picture here on the right. Whereas when the sun's at the peak in the sky, the beach, it's hard to sort through stuff, especially things that all blend together. And then again, the weather, the winds play an important role. And the longer that onshore breeze, that onshore wind persists, the better, because that's just going to bring everything that's out there in the Gulf Stream in. And then another good sign, if you see stuff like Portuguese man-o-war, especially this time of year, those are those jellyfish related ones with the big blue air sacs that float in. That's when those are washing ashore. That means that it's a good time to find the beans, but just be careful to watch where you're stepping. You don't want to step on those tentacles. And then again, with South Florida hurricanes, they're an annual event, and coming out after a storm is often a good time to find those hurricanes. Really will bring in all sorts of stuff. And then again, remember that sea beans, they can be found throughout the year. It's not only during those times. They sit on the beach, they sit under the sand. The sand will blow, and the beans are uncovered. So they can be abundant any time of the year. And then again, whether you polish them for jewelry, whether you puncture their coating and plant them, or you just simply keep them for a reminder of the wonders of the ocean and what's on beyond the horizon. I wish you good fortune in your hunting and your beach combing journey. So the other thing I just wanted to bring up, we talk about conservation, always related back to conservation, especially with this webinar series. While you're out there, be a good beach steward. So some of these things that to keep in mind when you're out there: don't litter. Of course, we mentioned some of the marine debris that washes up. Try to keep the beaches clean, and while you're looking for sea beans, do a cleanup. There's a local organization here called Fill a Bag. They put buckets out, and I know there's other ones up the coastline here, smaller ones that are in each municipality. Take a bucket and collect the marine debris that you find while you're looking for these treasures. Of course, our nesting season for sea turtles is coming up. That's usually March through October. So always good to be cognizant and don't disturb our nesting sea turtles, their eggs, even hatchlings that are making their way. That's an endangered species, and there's authorized personnel. Same thing with shorebird nesting. That happens on our beaches, and they're usually areas that are quarantined or cordoned off. Give them their space. Of course, you can call local organizations. FWC is always a good one, especially when it comes to sea turtles and shorebirds in distress. Don't trample on the dunes. That's one also, of course, if you're searching in the rack line up by the dune, just be careful of not trampling on the native vegetation. That's a really fragile ecosystem and something that we want to keep intact. I mentioned wildlife, but sometimes we have stranded wildlife. things like sea turtles or birds, whales, other marine mammals. So here's the number for FWC to call to report those. And then, of course, just raising awareness and educating others about the importance of, I talked about sargassum and the importance of that ecosystem. And then our beaches and keeping them resilient, keeping them free of trash, finding ways in our own daily lives that we can reduce that use or reuse or recycle and find the proper way to dispose of it in order to keep that out of the ocean and keep that from harming our wildlife. So I hope you keep those things in mind when you're out there on the beach searching for sea beans. All right, so one last thing before we conclude, and I get to answer questions from you guys. So if you can answer this poll, Anna's going to pull that up for you. It's just one question to indicate your level of agreement with the following statement. I learned something from watching this webinar. So I hope you all got something out of tonight's webinar, and we appreciate your feedback. And as Anna mentioned, if you have some questions that you've come up with, you can go ahead and put them in the chat now, and we're going to jump into that in just a sec. All right, we'll give that just a few more seconds here. All right, so thank you all for participating in that. And then just wanted to provide you guys with some different references. We have, and some of the things I reference when I'm searching for sea beans and finding out more about what's on our beaches. Seabean.com, there's a whole website dedicated to sea beans, not just collecting here in South Florida, but all around the world. There's this book here that I mentioned, Florida's Living Beaches. This is a great guide for not just for searching for ocean treasures, but for just any curious beachgoer. If you live along the beach and you're curious about the ecology or what's coming up on the beach, I would definitely recommend this book. You can find it on Amazon. It's called Florida's Living Beaches: A Guide for the Curious Beachcomber. And this is written by Blair and Don Witherington. We also have a few others here, some different ones that talk about drift seeds, some different websites. Of course, I mentioned that you can find these sea beans all the way up into North Carolina. So they've got some different publications that discuss that. So, all right, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining. I just put here on this slide our social media. Feel free to follow us to get more content, or to just learn more about some of our local ecology, both at Miami EcoAdventures and Miami-Dade Sea Grant. I put my email here if you guys, think of questions later on, or you just want to reach out to me, feel free to. The email is here. And then again, thank you for joining. And I'm going to turn it back over to Anna to moderate our Q&A session.
Ed, thanks a million. That was really, really interesting. Before we go on to go into our Q&A, I wanted to mention to everyone that this webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent out within the next week. And we will resume in March, on Wednesday, March 8th at 6 p.m. with our next conversation featuring Dr. Frank Ridgely of Zoo Miami, who will be talking about bat conservation in Miami-Dade County, and not bats like the baseball tool, but rather the slightly creepy but extremely interesting flying mammal. So with that, we're going to open up the floor to Q&A. So if you have to hop off, that's not a problem. We'll be staying on with Ed right now to keep taking questions.